Prisha Agarwal, and today I will be speaking with a passionate and empathetic leader, Sue Milazzo. She is a problem solver with experience in B2B e-commerce platforms, game design, and design platforms. Sue is a UX director at a marketing technology agency based in Texas. She has collaborated with teams in India, China, Europe, and of course, America. Welcome, Sue. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking a little bit about yourself.
Thanks for having me, Prisha. I appreciate it.
Yeah, how are you?
I'm good. I mean, it's definitely a weird time, but I'm good. It's been an adjustment period, I think, not only for myself, but obviously for the greater world at hand as well.
Yeah, it has been a weird time, but we'll get through it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get right into it.
Sure.
From a BA and a degree in psychology, how did you get to becoming a UX director at a marketing tech agency? Like, what was your journey?
So it's definitely a convoluted one. I never thought that I would be in the field, in the career that I'm at when I started, going my freshman year of college. You have this idea when you're right out of high school that you're going to be X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z didn't happen. There was a lot of twists and turns. And I was very fortunate enough to be able to stumble upon what user experience is and was, and then dive into it. Because while I was at school, user experience wasn't as hot of a topic as it is now. It's much more mainstream now. It's much more well known. And so when I figured out what it was and kind of like, oh, I can apply my psychology degree to this, it became kind of like a revelation for me to be like, oh, this is something I can pursue, because I went to school thinking I was gonna either become a doctor or, get my PhD, thinking like that's what you should do because that's what that was ingrained into me. But it was a lot of video games I played, and because of the video games and some job postings I saw for user experience with the requirement of psychology, that's actually how I ended up diving into it and just kind of being like, how can I get into this field? And if so, how can I best figure out opportunities for me to really just dive in.
So did you take any courses in college, or was it just you got to know about it and then you found out more about the actual job through internships and stuff like that?
Well, so when I was in school, there were no UX classes quite yet. There were some computer interaction classes, but beyond that, it wasn't as it is today, where you can find UX courses. You can find much more detailed programs. But when I was in school, that wasn't a thing. If it was a thing, I was not super aware of it. And so it was kind of a learning as you go experience, because when I figured out what UX stood for, it was just a lot of research on my own and trying to figure out, can I apply all the fundamentals from my psych degree? A lot of it is associated with cognitive psychology, right? Which if you're going to get a psych degree, chances are you're taking at least one or more classes associated with that. And so I was trying to take from that and be like, how can I overlap the two? Because there is an element of psychology / cognitive psychology that goes into user experience. But today, you can find a lot of those courses at colleges, outside of colleges. But back in my day in school, there was very little to none.
Yeah. That's really good, because one might think that you would take the traditional route of going to be a psychologist or a therapist, like you said, be a doctor, right? And you chose this, which is totally different and really cool. So that's great.
Yeah. My parents were very confused, for sure. They didn't really know. My parents are, first generation immigrants, and I'm very fortunate to be, second generation and be born and raised here. And, trying to explain to my very first generation folks what user experience is versus being a doctor, becoming a psychologist, even going into the psychology route, they're a little apprehensive because it's not very traditional.
Yeah.
And so to this day, they're like, hey, if you can make it work, whatever works for you, we won't push it, but we don't really know what you do.
Yeah. Wait, so how did you even choose that? When you were in high school, how did you choose the major of psychology? What pushed you to that?
So I didn't really know what I wanted to do in college. The whole idea of go to college, undergrad, prep to be pre-med, and psychology is a good avenue to, get all the classes you need for the pre-med route. And that was my initial intention. But like I said, a lot of things changed. I changed a lot in college and kind of like what I experienced and what I wanted. So 18-year-old me versus 20-something-year-old me had a lot of different motivations.
Yeah. I guess like what I was trying to ask was like why you chose psychology and like maybe not
Hmm.
biology or something like that.
Sure. And it's because I'm not great at the sciences.
Okay.
I'm not really great at the like biology, chemistry, and like going
Yeah.
to school for that. I realized I'm really bad at them. So psychology seemed like a much more, yes, it's based off of sciences, right? Like you have like psychological studies that you can definitely map towards, research reports, but it felt like something that resonated more with me.
Hmm. You were able to analyze yourself and like kind of make it.
Yeah, and realize like this is not the route for me. Like chemistry, biology, not my favorite thing in the world. Ironically, going the pre-med route, right?
Mhm.
And so I was like, let's try this and see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. And at the start of your career, you
Mm-hmm.
were a usability slash user experience intern,
Mm-hmm.
right? And why did you decide to do this? Like, why did you choose that as your internship, and how did it help you?
So I was interning at a really, really small game design studio.
Mhm.
And at that point in time, it's kind of hard to get into the industry sometimes when you have little to no experience or a lot of background associated with something, right? Like sometimes there's that notion that you won't be given a chance. So I, at that point in time, literally applied anywhere and everywhere to be an intern just to get some experience under my belt. And at the small game design studio, since I kind of fell in love with user experience, became very acclimated to it because of my experience with playing a lot of video games, I tried to, was trying to prepare myself to go into UX with the intent of game design. And so since the small game studio I was interning with was willing to let me just come in and just learn what I could, albeit it was a little bit of more QA versus user experience, it was still a learning opportunity for me to see kind of what the environment is working with those different individuals. Like what platforms do they use to create games? What do the developers do? How do they actually QA and how does it go live?
Mhm. Wow. So, how do you, for your current job, how do you zero down on user intuitive designs?
What do you mean by zero down on that? Like
How
hone
do
in on it?
you choose that this is the most like user friendly design? Because
So it really depends, right? Like you can't, like one design might work for one scenario, but
Mhm.
it doesn't always work for others.
Okay.
Just because you use a checkbox in one place doesn't mean you can use a checkbox everywhere else.
Mhm.
There's best practices usually aligned with any vertical, including user experience, right? So you want to definitely tie yourself to, or at least use it as a foundation. Use those best practices, use those patterns that do work, and leverage them as a starting point. However, humans are a lot more nuanced than that. So when it comes to an experience, it comes to them navigating a certain site, mobile app, etc. It really depends on the context around it. And one thing that, in the field that we kind of joke around a lot is our de facto answer is it depends.
Okay. And that's the psychology degree coming in. I can see that.
Yeah, and a lot of it is also testing, right? When it comes to user experience, you can design something and you might think that it's like the best thing in the whole wide world and that users are going to get it. One thing that we do is called usability testing, is where you get people who could be potential users and you test the prototype slash design with them. So instead of being like, do you like it or do you not like it? Because asking someone whether or not they like it is tricky because people are, typically want to make sure that they give you a positive answer, right? No one's going to say like your design's terrible and I hate it. Some people might, it's just a little off-putting and sometimes comes off as not professional. So when you ask that question, it's kind of putting you already in a hole. You're already putting yourself in like a barrier where you can't get really honest answers. By doing usability testing, where you're having the individual go through the experience and observing what they actually do or don't do, that gives you almost like a bird's eye view about what would they really do if they were looking at, say, an e-commerce site, and say I was standing behind them invisible, what would they actually do and interact with versus what they think they would.
Wow. So a lot of thinking goes into this whole process. right?
Yeah, and then a lot of times we're wrong. A lot of times the designs we put out are not as intuitive as we thought. Like, yes, they're based off of best practices. They're based off of experiences. They're based off of inspiration from other sites, examples, best in class, etc.
Mhm.
But it just, you never really know until you get into the weeds and you can actually see someone leveraging whatever platform or design that you're creating.
Mhm. And as I mentioned briefly in the intro, you've collaborated with teams in a lot of different places. You've
Mm-hmm.
collaborated with them in India, China. Um, so, how were your experiences different and similar?
Sure. I think there's almost like a difference in culture, right? You have the Western culture and you have the Eastern culture. And so when interacting with countries such as China, you're going to be interacting with an inherently Eastern culture. Not saying that it's completely 100% Eastern, but there is obviously an element to that. Whereas if you're interacting with countries like in North America, they're going to be most likely Western. So there is a difference in regards to kind of the Eastern being collectivist typically and the Western being individualistic. And those two, they overlap and then there's a lot of nuances there. So like, for example, the way I would interact with sometimes the coworkers I had in China would be a little bit more nuanced versus straightforward with my coworkers in North America, just because feedback is given differently. And so and also growing up here and growing up in a Western culture, I had to almost learn how it was best to interact with other cultures that I'm not nearly as familiar with, because certain things that you say, certain things that you do have slightly different meanings in different ways.
Mhm. So, you had to keep that in mind when you were
Oh, yeah. It's a
communicating.
lot about being empathic because it's really easy to forget that whoever you're interacting with on the end of a telephone or the end of a chat is a human being, because you might get frustrated. You can't see their face, you can't see their emotions, you don't interact with them, you don't have an interpersonal connection with them. So sometimes it's really easy to dehumanize them. So a lot of this has to do with creating, and you're trying to create an interpersonal relationship virtually. And it's sometimes hard to do when it's not in person and it's not organic. And so that is a big challenge. And that's something that I find I still try to advocate for today, is even though like that person might be working in a different time zone, different location, try to remember that they have their own lives. They want to leave at 5 p.m. their time as well. They want to go get happy hour. They have a pet at home, and they may not share things going on in their life with you because it's obviously sometimes difficult to do. But chances are they have their own problems. They have their own issues. They have their own stresses that you may not be privy to, but you do need to be, almost give people the benefit of the doubt and try to be as empathic as possible, because if not, you're going to end up in a tricky situation.
And I feel like that's the most important thing to remember, especially nowadays. It's
Mm-hmm.
so easy to forget other people when we have like our own lives to worry about, our own
Mm-hmm.
problems. But yeah, that's amazing. So what do you think? I know we already talked about some of your qualities, but what are your strongest qualities in your head that you feel like make you good at your job?
I think so. This is kind of tricky because it feels almost like a little bit of a humble brag, a
Go
little bit,
ahead.
right? Um, I think I don't fear more. Sometimes I don't fear asking questions. A lot of times people are very, concerned about like, oh, I don't want to come off as too aggressive, or I don't want to come off as too demanding, or ask too many questions.
Mhm.
My philosophy is ask all the questions. You never know what you're gonna get. Like, even though you think like there's no way in heck this is gonna happen, if you ask, it just might. And so that's something that I think helps me a lot in my own professional growth, is that I'm not afraid to ask those questions. There's a time and a place for them, obviously, but if you don't take that chance, no one's gonna give it to you.
Mhm. And I also feel like a lot of people think that questions that they may ask are dumb, or like that
Mm-hmm.
everybody already knows, and that may or may not be right. Like, I don't think any question is a dumb question,
Yeah.
right? Um, okay, and what do you think are some career options for people interested in this industry?
So it depends on kind of which route people are trying to go. So in the, realm of UX, there's a lot of new verticals that have popped up or they already existed and they are becoming much more mainstream. So such as, for example, like service design is very big in Europe and it's now making its way into the US. And so even though it's something that's already existed before, it's coming to light currently. And then there's people who say service design and user experience are not the same. Then you have other parties that say it's the same thing. So I think in order to get into this field, it's first and foremost, figure out if this is the field for you. Like, is human interaction, is user centricity, is kind of looking at the nuances of how people interact with things, something that you're passionate about. If you have that, then start digging into kind of routes of where can you find those internships. Yes, you can take classes, but there is obviously a large influx of individuals trying to get into this field. So it sometimes can get a little bit tricky because just there's a bajillion people trying to do the same thing. So try to figure out what your niche is. Like, even though you may not know it yet, start exploring what those options are. Maybe you go more towards the research side. Maybe you go more towards product design. Maybe you go more into service design and start exploring them to figure out like what really hits home. And then from there, start trying to tailor what you can do in regards to finding those internships, finding those job opportunities, because it is going to be competitive at times just because there's just so many people. And with COVID, it's even more competitive because a lot of people have gone through layoffs or trying to break into the field now. They've just graduated. There's a lot of factors to consider.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think are some good resources that someone can use to explore different?
Literally the entire internet. I mean, Nielsen Norman is obviously a good one. I think Creative Collection, I think it's called, it's ux.cc. I can't remember the acronym. And then The Design of Everyday Things is also a great book. It's just trying to figure out like what those resources that resonate most with you. Because you can buy all the books, but chances are you're not going to get through all of them, right? So try to figure out the ones that are going to help create that foundation of like, what are those best practices? What are the things that, are just consider the foundation and then build from there.
Awesome. And Sue, lastly, what advice do you have for the next generation of leaders?
In regards to figuring out like for future leaders, my advice would be try to figure out your own leadership style. Not everyone's leadership style is the same. In fact, you're going to encounter a whole myriad of different ones as you go through your career. You're going to have leaders that you are really inspired by, and you're going to have leaders that you may not connect with, and sometimes you're kind of sitting there going like, I don't get it. So try to figure out from those experiences that you gather from those other leaders, like what kind of leader do you want to be? And it could be almost a mix of them. It could be completely separate, and then try it out. And you're going to have like really tough conversations. Your leadership style is not going to always resonate with the team that you're potentially managing, and adjust from there to make sure that you're able to fulfill what you need in order to be a good leader, but also lift up your team. Being a leader is not an individual thing at all. It's a group effort. In order for you to be a good leader, the whole group needs to be needs to be together. It can't just be you trying to lead the charge and everyone's trailing behind you. You need to be a leader that helps push your whole team forward so that you can help lead them much more efficiently as well.
Thank you, Sue. That was some great advice. Very insightful. And have a great day, Sue. Thank you.
Thank you.